A wagon's wheel cracked through the frozen yard as Master
Jonah,
Keller's voice
did you
called
do
for the
this?
children to
Yes.
line up.
Who helped you? Give me names.
Jonah Meyer moved
The
before
ledger
the
doesn't
sentence
lie,
finished.
Jonah.
I'm telling you,
Protectiveness
the entries are
tightened his
wrong.
hands the way a
Wrong.
child squeezes
But
a
the
small
shifts are
toy,
right, I
and that
swear.
protectiveness pushed him toward the gate. He had watched younger faces all week, counting which ones still smiled at him at dusk. The conflict was clear. The cart meant selection, and selection meant leaving.
Contract is terminated,
Jonah
Mr.
felt
Mayor.
the shape of that choice in
Can't
his
do
ribs
this.
and stepped into the open where the yard met mud. The foreman barked orders, line up. Names now. Master Keller walked the length of the yard, breath visible, leather gloves tucked under his arm. Children shuffled. Jonah kept his eyes on the youngest cluster, 2 boys with loose sleeves, and a girl with a ribbon frayed at the edge. Because the promise he had made himself was simple. He would not let the small ones go alone. Matron Haviland stood on the steps, ledger tucked under her arm like a constant weight. She did not shout. Her voice was a measured list, roll call, she said. Her thumb kept a hidden rhythm on the edge of the paper. Jonah watched her mark slips with a brass pencil. The emotion at the center of Jonah's choice was protectiveness. It shaped everything he did now. Jonah's view held details. The yard smelled of coal and boiled starch. The children's breath made thin ghosts. Jonah's palms were rough from folding clothes, but the motion steadied his pulse. He remembered nights when a younger child had cried, and he had covered the face with his scarf until the matron's lamp moved past. That small memory of the girl with the frayed ribbon lying awake and Jonah pressing a palm against her forehead moved him to stand closer to her now. He kept his voice low. Jonah, Matron Haviland, scanning names. She pronounced names like accounts. Clear, final, Jonah Meyer. She underlined his name without pausing. The line tightened. Jonah stepped forward and felt every pair of eyes curve toward him. Master Keller stopped by Jonah and tested his grip on a rough wooden beam set up for practice. He tapped Jonah's knuckles and watched. Strong hands. Keller muttered, good for a bench or the loom. His tone carried a shift, clinical approval. Jonah's protectiveness shifted to calculation. If his hands were useful, perhaps he could make that usefulness serve the small ones. Some boys muttered. A boy named Will nudged Jonah. They'll take the little ones first. Will kept his sentences short. His voice jittered. Jonah nodded once. Matron continued. She read a cluster of names and paused only when a thin slip of paper changed her face. She did not look up. Her action alone created an early puzzle for Jonah. The ledger was not just a list, it was an accounting. The first external event after the wagon's arrival had already put a decision on the table. When the inspection moved along, Keller leaned to Jonah and said, "They need hands, not boys with dreams." His voice was blunt. Jonah, nothing. He tightened his hand around nothing and thought of the carving in his pocket. The small wooden bird a girl had given him in winter. The children lined against the low wall. Jonah's watchfulness shifted again. Suspicion moved through him when he noticed Matron's finger marking more slips than she read aloud. He could not explain it with words then, but the movement felt like a hidden mechanism. Suspicion became a quiet plan. See find, no. He needed to see what the ledger told. After roll call, the yard stalled. A younger child, Thomas, peered at the wagon and clutched his sleeve. Jonah moved closer to Thomas without thinking. Stay by me, Jonah. The line broke with small noises, a shoe scrape, a swallowed breath. Jonah had used his voice to command once before in this yard, and the memory steadied him now. The feeling in his chest shifted from suspicion to resolve. Matron Haviland called 3 names and the wagon's driver stepped forward. Jonah watched the chosen children walk with stiff shoulders. One child, Maggie, with the frayed ribbon, kept looking at the wall where Jonah stood. When she passed, Jonah caught her sleeve with 2 fingers. He did not release it. The harried shouts of the driver and Keller's curt orders made the yard a small theater of command. Keller's inspection had left marks on several children's knuckles where he tested their fingers for steadiness. Jonah thought of long hours bent at a bench, of hands learning to press rhythm into wood. He thought of the matron's ledger again. Mid-morning carried Jonah into the matron's narrow office while the wagon's creak faded from the yard. He slipped in through a back door when the matron's steps sounded elsewhere. The room smelled of boiled linen and camphor. A small window held raw light. Jonah's heartbeat changed into a steady thump each time he turned the pages. He found the ledger face down on a table. The cover was worn. His fingers brushed dates and columns. Names, ages, prices, every page was an arrangement. Jonah read figures and the names of mills scribbled next to them. The ledger explained the wagon's purpose in exact numbers. Placements scheduled, payments due. The discovery altered everything Jonah believed about the orphanage. The institution that had given him shelter now had a ledger that planned children like merchandise. He heard footsteps near the door and jerked the book closed. His breath matched his pulse. A single thought pressed into him. If he could show others, perhaps someone would stop the arrangements. The discovery shifted his protectiveness into anger. He had been guarding faces. Now he wanted to rescue a ledger's victims. Matron Haviland returned before Jonah could move the book. She found him with the ledger open. Her face did not break into outrage. She set a hand on the paper as if returning a tool to its place. "Jonah," she said, steady and low, "you shouldn't go through other people's things." Her voice carried a ledger like calm. Her hands folded over the spine. Jonah stood frozen. He knew what to say only in fragments. Why are names written with amounts? Jonah. His voice came out short. Matron's eyes held the ledger's weight. "We keep the home going, Jonah. The wages from placements pay for the others. It is how we survive." She spoke with the same measured tone she used for roll call. Her words tried to give care a mechanical shape. She reached for his shoulder and paused, measuring the effect. Jonah's anger moved into negotiation. He could feel the plan forming in his hands. "You sell them." He kept his sentences short. "Do you tell them they're safe?" Matron Haviland's jaw tightened. "Jonah, we do what we must. These children are trained. They leave with a skill and a wage." Her voice edged towards steel. The ledger remained a solid object between them and all unspoken arrangements. Jonah pushed further. "Which ones go today?" He the name of Thomas softly. The matron's thumb flicked the paper and her eyes met his. Thomas is listed. But she stopped. The office held a brief pause. Jonah saw the motion of her breath falter. There was no melodrama. There was a practical calculation that scraped against his plan. The scene changed back in the yard when Master Keller called the final list. He read names precisely. Maggie Haviland, Thomas Lang, Will Barron, each name landed with a measured tone. Children shuffled. Jonah heard a child's cry cut off by a hand. He moved forward when the matron made a small sign toward the wagon. At the wagon door, Jonah stepped between a younger child and the foreman. His legs trembled, but he kept his voice steady. "You will not take him, Jonah it plainly." Keller looked at Jonah and then at Matron. "Move aside, boy," Keller barked. His voice wanted obedience. Jonah's protectiveness turned to blunt defiance. "You will not take him," Jonah repeated. He planted his feet. The yard stilled. Matron Haviland's gaze slid from Keller to Jonah. She did not shout. She placed the ledger on her desk again and walked down the steps. A small confrontation heated the space. Keller's jaw worked as he measured the boy in front of him. "You are in the way." "Jonah," he hit in 3 plain words. Jonah's fingers curled around the hem of the child's shirt. He refused to let go. Matron Haviland put a hand on Jonah's shoulder. "Jonah," she said quietly, "you must step back." Her voice had no plea. It was fact. Jonah swallowed. "I won't let him go alone," he said. Keller stepped forward and snapped his fingers. "Step aside now," he hit more sharply. Jonah felt his knees shake. He thought of the ledger and the numbers written beside Thomas's name. He thought of the small wooden bird in his pocket. Jonah's resolve moved to urgency. A brief back and forth followed, each line clipped. "Jonah, move." "Keller." "No." Jonah answered. "Matron, he needs removing." Keller urged. "Not today," Matron replied. "Jonah, you will bring trouble." Keller warned. "I will not let Thomas go alone, Jonah." The quick exchange lasted only seconds but changed the yard's rhythm. Children breathed in and out in holds. The wagon driver's hand tightened on a rope. Master Keller's face tightened. Matron Haviland's eyes shifted to her desk and then to the ledger within reach. Matron Haviland turned away from the immediate spectacle and walked back to her desk. She took up the ledger and drew a line through Thomas's name, then penciled a small note beside Jonah's. Her hand moved with the same steady economy as before. Jonah watched each stroke. Her solution was not a refusal but a bargain. She spared the youngest child but altered the ledger to bind Jonah instead. When she announced the change aloud, her voice remained low. Thomas will remain. She closed the ledger. Jonah will take another placement later. He will be needed in the workshop here for 3 months. She the length with the tone of scheduling. Jonah's protectiveness shifted into a different shape then, into the hard realization that his choice carried a cost. He had saved Thomas, and in return he would remain pledged to the institution's plan in another way. The yard's tension eased a fraction. Some children breathed out. Jonah's hands unclenched slowly. Keller looked at Matron and then at Jonah. He nodded once. Good, he said. His acceptance was practical and begrudging. He handed the wagon's rope back to the driver. The selected children climbed up into the cart. Jonah watched their faces one by one. Maggie pressed her forehead to Jonah's arm for a second. "Don't forget us," she said. Her voice was small. Jonah could feel her breath in the same space as his sleeve. He kept the words short. He answered only with a look. The wagon moved away with a groan. Wheels met mud. The driver cracked the reins. The yard emptied of the chosen bodies, but the ledger remained a heavy thing in the office and a new fact in Jonah's hands. He had intervened, and the matron had recorded the intervention as compliance and as cost. That ledgered mercy changed the terms of Jonah's life. When the cart passed beyond the gate, Jonah and the remaining orphans stood near the wall. Jonah felt relief and dread handing off in quick beats. Relief because Thomas had not been taken that day. Dread because the ledger showed that choices could be traded, that mercy could be scheduled. Matron Haviland returned to the steps and folded her hands over the brass brooch at her collar. She spoke to the group in the same low, careful tone she always used. "We keep what we can," she said. There was no plea in the words, only alleged fact. Jonah did not hear comfort in them. He heard arrangement. Jonah walked to the gate and lifted the latch. The gate felt heavier than it had that morning. He looked at the road where the wagon had disappeared, and then back at the matron. His wooden bird pressed into his palm. His hand shook once and then stopped. He had acted. He had learned that the institution both saved and scheduled. A decision had been recorded that spared one child and tied another into a site's needs. Jonah's last look of the chapter fixed on Matron Haviland writing in the ledger again, entries flowing into the same pages he had just read. He folded his fingers around the bird and left the office door slightly ajar as he walked away. Outside, the yard seemed quieter. Clothes moved on lines. Children returned to chores. Jonah moved among them like someone who had crossed a thin line and found it marked. He now understood that resistance had a cost, and that cost could be measured on paper. The chapter ends with Jonah standing at the gate, the latch in his hand, his decision taken and recorded, and Matron Haviland returning to her ledgered tasks inside the house. Matron Haviland pushed the pin through the damp paper, and the board shivered under the nails as children swarmed the corridor. Fear tightened Jonah Meyer's chest when he saw a cramped handprint beside a younger boy's name and the word. Immediate, he stepped forward before the pin cooled. "Jonah, back up, matron," her voice even. That single morning act, the list on the board, made the problem plain. Some children would be marched away by noon. Jonah had watched a wagon leave the yard once before. He knew the sound. The wagon's wheel had cracked through the frozen yard when Master Keller called for the children last week. He remembered the cold air that day and the metallic bite of the foreman's whistle. That memory kept Jonah's palms turning invisible against his sleeves as he tried to hold himself steady now. He tightened his fingers on his scarf and scanned the faces around him. Matron Haviland read names aloud with the ledger folded under her arm. Elliot Turner, immediate placement. Thomas Reed, deferred. She did not look up. Her tone translated the paper into duty. Jonah heard Master Keller's heavy steps in the doorway before Keller spoke. "Haviland. Keller, which boys are fit to send today? I need 2 steady hands and 1 apprentice for the bench." His voice carried the factory's rhythm. "Quotas, speed. and the unspoken measure of value. Jonah's fear shifted into a tight, hot anger like a coal pressed between his ribs. He moved to a younger child, a small boy whose eyes were the color of watered tea. Jonah placed his scarf gently over the child's shoulders. He did not speak. The scarf was a private act. It both shielded and said something to the smaller boy. A clerical attendant watched and stepped forward to check pockets. The attendant's fingers closed over a wooden carving Jonah had once whittled in a spare hour. No keepsakes here, the attendant said, flipping the charm under the light. The charm was a rough shape of a ship. Jonah lifted his chin. That belongs to Sam, he said. Jonah's voice held a quiet insistence. Let him keep it. The attendant's mouth flattened. Matron, he said. Matron Haviland did not move her head. She checked the ledger margin, then looked at Jonah Haviland. Master Keller called again, sharper. If you keep them whole, or you pass them along. I have men waiting. Matron's fingers found the ledger, and the room filled with the ink, scrape sound as she turned a page. She spoke of accounts and rates with the same calm with which she pinned notices. We cannot retain more than we can feed, she said. 2 placements today covers the coal for the next month. Jonah heard figures where the other children heard obligations. He felt his stomach lurch as the ledger's arithmetic translated boys into pounds and shillings. Keller crouched and examined Jonah's hands. You will do for the bench. Keller without softness. Are you quick? Jonah kept his hands closed. He knelt once to pull a thread from his sleeve and smoothed it back into place. Jonah was marched to the workshop at noon. The workroom smelled of sawdust and boiled oil. Master Keller set a wooden bench between other boys who bent forward like a row of bowed heads. You move fast or you don't get supper. Keller. He tapped the bench with a gloved fist. Jonah felt the rhythm of the tools like a tide. Pick, set, file, repeat. He watched the senior apprentice at the far bench move without hesitating. The apprentice's movements were shortened for what saved men from the whip. Speed and silence. Jonah's unease shifted into a practical focus. He counted the motions in his hands. He mimicked the senior apprentice's thumb placement and how the foreman read collises as sentences on a worker's palms. When the apprentice glanced at Jonah, Jonah nodded. Keller. The apprentice muttered once, "He's steady enough." Jonah answered with a short, "Yes, sir." He kept his voice low. While fetching a small brass punch for a joint, Jonah cut across the courtyard to the private entrance. He paused when he heard voices behind the door of Matron's office. The hinges were old and they gave a thin creak. Jonah crouched on the stair and watched through a slit of frosted glass. Matron and Keller sat at the table with the ledger open between them. Matron held a pen. Keller had his pocket watch open and tapped the chain. Keller, payment on the Turner lot came through. They'll take 2 more next week, if you can spare them. He named sums and times like a tradesman checking coins. Matron's hand moved to a row of names on a different page. She signed once, the pen scratching as if counting the cost of warmth. Jonah felt a small sudden dislocation. He had thought the matron stern but a protector of the house. Now he saw her sign as a clerk signs bills. The discovery shifted Jonah's anger into a sharper, clearer indignation. He pushed the door and knocked with the heel of his hand. The sound was loud in the small hall. Matron Haviland did not start. She looked up, pen clasped between 2 fingers. "Jonah," she said. "Not surprised you should not be here." Keller rose and crossed his arms. "You shouldn't be snooping, either," he said. His tone left no room for argument. Jonah kept his stance as if braced for a shove. "Why sign their names, Jonah?" His voice was steady despite how his hands trembled. "Why do they go?" Matron watched him a full beat. "We keep the house running, Jonah," she said. "Payment keeps the doors fixed, the food on the table. You know that, payment for boys, Jonah." He the words slowly, letting each one land. "You sign their names and send them away." Keller's jaw shifted. "We place them where they will be fed and used." "That's better than the streets. Is it better? Jonah is being taken at dawn better than being cold." The argument moved fast after that. Jonah pressed where he felt the ledger had been slicing open the room. He named children he knew, Elliot, Thomas, Sam, and Keller answered with numbers and timelines. Their exchange became a rapid, hard back and forth, cutting and tightening like the hands on a clock. "Matron, you cannot." Jonna, matron replied. "We cannot keep every child who cries, then choose a name that isn't a boy with a cough." "Jonna, we follow the list, Jonna!" Keller snapped. "We need reliable hands. You make them reliable by sending them." "Keller!" Jonna answered. The meeting broke with a soft but absolute sound. Matron closed the ledger and pushed it across the table. "Enough," she said. "You will return to your bench." Her hand rested flat on the ledger as if to anchor the rules in place. Jonna did not leave empty-handed. He had seen the ledger, the names, the way Matron's pen curved over prices. The ledger made the institution legible in a new way, and that realization rested on him like a stone. He carried it back into the workshop and into the rows of boys who bent to their tasks. The bench hummed with the rhythm of small, necessary violence, hands trimmed to motion, back set to keep hours. At mid-afternoon, Jonna moved to the courtyard with another boy under his arm, trying to pull him behind a stack of crates to keep him from the line. He used the crates as a shield. He bent and whispered, "Go round the south side. Lie down until they pass." The younger boy's breath hitched. When Keller's whistle sounded, Jonna kept his head low and tried to shepherd the child out of sight. Keller saw him move and stepped across the yard with a long, sure stride. Jonna held that boy by the arm. Keller, his voice like the iron tongue of a bell. Jonna did not let go. He tightened his grip, let him go. Keller again, and this time his hand found Jonna's collar. Jonas felt that the rough cuff of Keller's glove pressed to his neck. He heard Matron's voice then, cool and final. "Regulate his duty, Jonna." He breaks ranks and faces placement. A crowd gathered. The younger boy leaned away, eyes wide. Keller's hand was on Jonna's shoulder, and the steadiness in Keller's grip spoke of the order he kept in a factory. Matron signed a small line in the ledger and turned to the crowd. "Jonna Meyer," she said, "you will be put to immediate retraining. You have interfered with placements." Jonna's defiance and fear collided. His mouth tightened. He tried to pull the younger child closer. "Please," he murmured. "Please, matron." "Order, matron," and the word closed the space between them. Keller stepped forward. "We cannot have obstruction," he said. "You will work the bench under closer watch." Jonna's resistance, which had burned bright and hot, moved into a slow, stubborn quiet. He did not shout back. Instead, he pressed the smaller child's shoulder, an action that said more than any speech. They led Jonna back through the hall, where the board still held its pinned names. The rearrangement of names took place with a mechanized calm. Matron crossed a line and wrote another name in a column. She handed a slip to an attendant. The attendants moved like administrative gears, eyes down, hands steady. The room's temperature felt as if a door had been closed. All small motions continued, but a measure of personal choice had been removed. The punishment was procedural. Privileges revoked, a day's sweet ration withheld, and Jonna reassigned to tasks that kept him in sight. The elder boys watched him with measured glances. Some considered the danger of taking risks. Others let their eyes slip back to the work. Jonna's hands hummed with residual heat from exertion. He did not let himself look at the list again. At dusk, Jonna waited by the dormitory window while the corridor cooled. He slipped his wooden carving into his pocket. The carved ship fit his palm. It was rough but steady to the touch. He handed it briefly to the smaller child, Sam, who clutched it and turned it over with clumsy fingers. Sam's mouth formed a small, surprised smile. Jonna answered with a look that contained the promise of protection, not a speech but a quiet, concrete pledge. "Sam, Jonna, keep it until morning. Hide it in the seam of your trousers. Do it now." Sam nodded. He pressed the wooden hole into the seam and folded the cloth over it until it could not be seen. The action was simple and exact, a physical oath. Outside, the yard echoed with the late steps of men who had taken boys that day. Jonna had watched a cart back away once, and the board of the wagon had clattered like a closing lid. He thought of that sound now and how the ledger had named the whole transaction. His understanding shifted again, this time into a kind of careful resolve. He would not stop the system. He was not large enough, but he could hold small things for small people. He could keep a carved ship, a scarf, a whispered corner of time. Matron Haviland closed the door to the assembly hall and walked past Jonah without looking at him. Her ledger lay open in the private room, but the house had already rearranged itself by action, a child taken, a bench made tighter, a ration removed. That evening Matron moved in the corridors with the same steady steps that had once calmed him. Jonah watched her pin the board for the next morning and felt the ledger's presence like an accounted shadow. He placed his hands on the sill and breathed the cold air. The city's lamps threw a thin line of light across the square. He pictured the wagon wheel in the frozen yard and the sound that had come with it. Jonah's last motion of the night was to fold his scarf into the pocket where the carving slept in another child's seam. He did not say anything. He only turned from the window and stepped toward his bunk. A knock came at the outer gate as Jonah reached the foot of the ladder. The sound was sharp and distinct. He paused with one hand on the rung. Someone called a name aloud, Matron's name, then a messenger's hurried voice. Matron answered from the hall. She left without a backwards look. The knock could be a merchant or a collector. It might be a man with more names to trade. Jonah felt the ledger unclose in the house like a page turning. Jonah climbed his ladder and lay down between two boys who slept with their faces toward the thin light. He pulled the blanket up to his chin and felt the fabric's weight. His palms found his pocket empty, and then closed on the memory of the carved ship hidden on Sam. He let his breath ease. The chapter ended not on a vow but on a detail. Matron's pen left a fresh mark in the ledger, and a slip was passed to an attendant. The sound of the pen and the rustle of the paper carried farther than any of their words. Jonah felt that sound like a hinge closing, and he let it settle against his ribs. He did not try to unmake the list. He pressed his thumb to the seam of his pocket and imagined Sam's fingers finding the little ship in the morning. That concrete hope was enough to keep his hands from shaking as the dormitory settled into the measured breathing of boys who had worked through the day. The wagon wheels ground over the frozen yard again as Master Keller barked, "Line up." Fear tightened Jonah Meyer's throat and pushed his feet forward before his head could think. He stepped between a smaller boy and the gate with hands folded as if holding something fragile, and his breathing shortened into a steady rhythm that kept his voice from shaking. The central problem was plain. The wagon had come for the orphanage's quota, and someone would be handed away before dusk. Jonah knew the ledger and the ledger's rules by the way other boys moved when they thought they might be named. He had watched Matron Haviland mark names with the needle the week before, and had felt the ledger's teeth in his chest then. Now the wagon idled, iron rim humming, and Master Keller's shadow fell long across the line of small bodies. Jonah's first action was to place himself where a child with a scraped knee had stood, palms flat to the cold, ready to take any shove. Matron Haviland stood near the doorway, ledger in hand, collar stiff and eyes fixed. She counted on her fingers as she assessed the children. The same small finger, counting motion Jonah had memorized from watching her. "Jonah, hold there," she said without looking up, voice low and measured. Keller's boots thudded on the stones. "We need 3 today, Haviland. I told them I'd bring men." Jonah watched Keller's mouth when he spoke. The foreman's words were brief and produced movement, like a lever pulled tight. The courtyard smelled of coal smoke and damp wool. A younger boy, Thomas, kept his chin tucked and stared at the wagon's wheel as if it might speak up for him. Jonah felt protectiveness rise so quickly it made his chest ache. He moved his hands the way he always did when he wanted to steady another child, smoothing a sleeve, adjusting a collar. The immediate danger was the selection itself. Who would be signed away? Jonah's body reacted first. His voice came after. "Matron Keller called, moving closer. We have a quota and a schedule. Men wait." "I cannot keep them waiting." His tone had no heat, but it carried the force of a demand. Matron's hand found the ledger and turned a damp page. Jonah could see the pinholes where names had been nailed in the corridor last week. He remembered the cramped handprint beside a younger boy's name and the word, immediate, that memory stiffened Jonah's fingers. Matron Haviland set the ledger on a narrow table and pushed her spectacles up her nose with 2 deliberate motions. She spoke with a calm that had edges. "We must keep the place open, Keller. The rent and the baker's tabs are due. If we refuse, they close the contracts on all of us." Jonna watched her voice do the arithmetic in the air. Ledger lines, pound signs, dates. He heard numbers as plainly as if Matron had tapped them on the tabletop. Keller's reply was a short series of orders. "Then show me who can work. Test them at the benches. If they move quick, they'll go. If not, we find other men." He snapped his fingers, and 2 keepers stepped forward to herd the children toward the workshop. Jonah made sure Thomas was beside him and squeezed his shoulder once, hard enough so the boy flinched, then nodded. They marched to the interior workshop with its long wooden benches and a single lamplight that threw hard circles onto the work surface. The room smelled of shavings and oil. Young hands hung at sides, knuckles pale with cold and effort. Jonah could hear the rhythm of other boys clearing their throats and the scrape of heavy boots. He kept his hands folded until Keller signaled them to begin. Keller set a small wooden spool on the bench and tapped his pocket watch. 2 minutes each. "Show me hands that will not fail on the loom. Show me speed. Show me steady fingers." He pushed a blunt metal ruler across the bench and measured distances with the precision of a tradesman. Jonah watched the measuring and felt his own pulse match the ticking of the watch. Jonah worked with slow, careful motions at first. He guided Thomas's hands under his breath. When the keeper's gaze flicked too near, "Keep the fingers curled." Jonah murmured while the keeper was still facing away. Thomas's laugh was tiny and afraid. Jonah faltered when Keller leaned in and watched his thumb step back. "Maya, Keller, let him do it himself." Jonah stepped back but kept an arm near enough to touch a sleeve if needed. When Keller timed Jonah, the foreman made 1 short note in the margin and then moved on. He tested 3 more boys and then returned with the same measured expression. Jonah's quiet hope tightened. The ledger in Matron's office was a palpable thing to him now. Its pages meant assignments and departures. He had learned to look for the ink that meant a place out of the yard and the ink that meant loss. At midday, while flames licked a small brazier at the workshop's far end, a younger child faltered and collapsed against a wooden lathe. Jonah's hands reached without thought. He lifted the boy's shoulders, felt the slack of small limbs, and smelled the salt of sweat on his cheek. The boy's lips were pale and his breath came shallow. "He's fainted." Jonah, holding the child's head in his lap. "Help him. Please." His voice cracked with an edge that had no room for schooling. The keeper stepped forward and pressed a hand to the boy's back, then looked to Matron Haviland and Keller, as if asking permission to care. Matron Haviland crossed to the lathe and bent over the child, counting pulselessly on her fingers before she spoke. Her hands moved to the boy's coat and she felt the ribs under the thin cloth. She straightened and said, "This child will not meet the quota today. He cannot be sent like this." Jonah felt relief flare, then dim. Relief because the child might be safe, dim because Matron's words had soft corners. Keller's mouth tightened. "We can't make exceptions. Contracts are written for people who can move. You know this, Haviland." He tapped the ledger with a calloused finger as if the book itself contained teeth. Jonah could see the logic shifting in Keller's stance. The mill's demand translated directly into the child's removal or retention. Matron looked at Jonah then, and the ledger lay open between them. Jonah stepped forward, anger rising sharp and hot under the skin that had learned to hide. "Don't take him," he said. "He's been here since last winter." "He can't." He stopped because his voice hit Matron's measured face and saw nothing change. "Jonah, Matron." She kept her voice low, but every word held weight. "If we hide him, they close our name on the contract, and we lose the bakery and the coalman. More children starve. I do this to keep the others here. I do it to make sure there are hands to wash, to feed, to mend." Jonah watched her make a calculation in the air with small movements. Paper, seal, bread. He wanted to argue, to spill his protectiveness into a confrontation, but Matron's reasoning had the cold logic of a ledger. The argument turned quick and edged into a small back and forth between Matron and Keller, Haviland, Keller, voice flat, we promised the men. It's either this child or someone else. I take the ones that can still work, Matron snapped a quiet retort. Then you will take the ones who can keep the place open, Keller, and not the ones who might die at the loom. The exchange had 3 short lines. Jonah felt the room tilt toward a decision. The keeper at the lathe glanced at Jonah and then lowered his gaze. He did not speak. Jonah took the child's hand and held it between both of his own. The fingers were limp and small. He thought of the frail boy's mother, of stories he had heard spoken in whispers in the dormitory about women who left and did not come back. He thought of names written on nails and then pulled free. The protective hunger in him became a plan made of narrow choices. After the collapse, Jonah slipped away toward Matron's office, while the workshop hummed with men moving and watchful glances. He moved with the practiced steps of someone who had learned to be invisible when it served him. The corridor smelled of boiled starch and camphor from Matron's coat. The ledger nook door was ajar by a finger's width. Jonah pushed it open and crouched. He found the ledger where Matron kept it, lying on a small table beneath a lamp. The lines of names marched down the page in neat ink. Jonah's fingers hovered over the entries. He remembered the pin through the damp paper and the cramped handprint beside a younger boy's name from before. He turned pages slowly until his eyes caught a column that had been folded in and then hidden, an extra column in a cramped hand that listed mill names and dates. His breath hitched. A sound in the hall made Jonah freeze. Footsteps measured and carrying a soft scrape Matron's steps. He snapped the ledger closed and slid it under a stack of folded shirts. His heart thudded so loudly he feared it would betray him. He set a small wooden carving, the one he kept in his pocket, on top of the shirts to hide the scrape where he'd lift the ledger. His hand trembled when he did it. The door opened and Matron Haviland's silhouette filled the frame. She looked older in the doorway, hair pinned tight, collar straight. She paused and said, "Jonah." Jonah swallowed and met her eyes without turning. "Matron, you left the ledger open." He kept his words even. He felt fear shift into a sharper form. Dread pushed him into a quick breath, then anger at the ledger's hidden column. He had moved from protectiveness to suspicion. Matron stepped in and closed the door with careful hands. She crossed the small space and regarded Jonah without surprise. "Did you touch the ledger?" she asked. Jonah's pulse slowed as he framed his answer. He could not say nothing. Silence meant suspicion. "I looked," he admitted. "There are names recorded with mills and dates." He kept his voice even, letting the facts stand on their own. He watched Matron's face as if watching a scale. Matron's fingers found the ledger, and she did not flinch when she saw the hidden column. Her mouth moved like she was tasting an unpleasant thing. "They tie contracts directly to us now," she said, voice flat. "The mills send lists and the agents mark them. It makes the paperwork smoother for them. I keep a copy so I know their timetables." Jonah felt a momentary shift from suspicion to a bleak clarity. The ledger's cover hid a mechanism he had not expected. It names mills and dates. It says who goes and when. Matron's face folded into the rationed features of an administrator. She sat, placed the ledger on her lap, and smoothed a sleeve. "Yes. It saves us the trouble of choosing by eye alone. It keeps our name respectable with the employers. It keeps us open so children can sleep here." Her voice tightened as she crafted the sentence into a justification. Jonah watched her make the economy of it out loud. Jonah's next move was an attempt at a private plea. He put both hands flat on the desk and leaned forward as close as he dared. "Matron, take his name out. The injured boy. Don't hand him over." "Please," he spoke quickly, words clumped and urgent. Matron's fingers closed over the ledger and held it like a thing that must not be dropped. "Jonah, I know. But the ledger is not mine to rewrite. Contracts are set. If I remove a name, an agent will notice. We lose our standing. We may close." Jonah felt anger flare hot and rapid. He shifted from dread into confrontation, his voice low and hard. "So you sign him over?" he asked. "You put your books before a child?" His words were blunt. Matron's reply was steady. "I sign what keeps the door open. I have to choose the many over the one sometimes. It is cruel. It is necessary. If you want the place to stay." We must keep to their dates. Jonna heard the moral calculation in her voice and felt a fresh change. From confrontation to a cold resignation. The ledger's column had made the choice a matter of survival for the institution, and Matron's mind had already balanced that on the scales. He stood and left the office without further words. The corridor seemed longer and the lamplight harsher after the ledger. He found Thomas near the benches with a saucer in his hands and the brazier smoking low. Jonah crouched and placed his palm over Thomas's small one. "They'll pick someone tonight," he said. Thomas did not look up. His eyes were fixed on the saucer. Dusk came and the yard filled with fog that clung low to the cobbles. The wagon's driver called for his men and Keller readied a small stack of papers. Matron took a pen and wrote a short note with the same slow, deliberate hand she used for the ledger. Jonah watched her sign and felt a rawness open in his chest. He understood that her signature would change a life. At the gate the injured child lay on a pallet, blanket pulled up to his collar. Jonah reached out and smoothed the blanket before anyone could object. Keller stood beside the wagon with his leather gloves and a pocket watch hung like a promise at his waist. The keeper restrained Jonah's arm before he could lunge. "Let him go," the keeper said quietly. Jonah twisted under the grip and tried to pull free. "Jonah, stop." Matron, voice steady but firm. Her hand rested on the ledger at her side. "You must not make this harder. This will be over soon." Jonah's breath came fast. He looked at the child's face and felt his hands go numb then hot. He tried to speak, but the keeper tightened his hold. Keller took the child's wrist and tested for strength with the blunt curiosity of a man checking a tool. He did not look at Jonah when he said, "We take him now. He will eat and be set to work." Matron slid the signed paper across the gate and placed it into Keller's hand. She did not meet Jonah's eyes. Jonah moved once, a quick, violent lunge that pulled the keeper's arm and left him bruised on the stone. The keeper held his ground. "Jonah!" someone cried. The call pulled the courtyard into a sudden motion. Jonah's attempt failed, and the child was lifted toward the wagon by two men. Keller's hand closed over the child's coat and a strap held him in place. The wagon's driver swung the gate shut and the men climbed up behind with a dull efficiency. Jonah watched the child that he had tried to protect climb into the wagon's dark. The gate shut with a hard, final clunk. The driver snapped the reins and the horses stepped forward. The wagon moved away into the fog with a rhythm that matched Jonah's ragged breathing. He sank to the low bench and pressed his forehead into his palms until the stone bit through his fingers. The yard returned to its dim routine. Boys shuffled back to benches, keepers picked up tools, and the brazier hissed. Jonah went to the empty pallet the injured child had left and folded his small wooden carving into the cloth. He set it where the child's hand had rested, a small, deliberate act that felt like something between a prayer and a promise. He arranged the blanket so it looked as if someone might come back to it. That precise motion steadied him a little. Matron Haviland walked past Jonah without stopping. Her collar was starched to a point, and she kept her ledger tucked beneath her arm like a folded truth. Jonah watched her as she moved toward the dormitory, the ledger a quiet weight against her hip. He felt anger and fatigue fold together into a slow resolve. He would not speak grandly of change, but he would look for small ways to protect others. He stood and found Thomas by the windowsill, looking at the rain-streaked glass. He nothing for a long moment, then placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder and guided the boy to the empty pallet. Their hands arranged the blanket together, and Jonah the child, in small, clipped sentences, where the bread ration was kept, how to find the spare scarf, which adult to ask for when a fever came. Jonah's instructions were concrete, a map of small protections. The night held the sound of distant wheels and the low murmur of city life beyond the yard wall. Jonah lay down on his own pallet with the same rigid sleep posture he used to keep from dreaming of empty hands. He felt the bruise on his arm where the keeper had held him and the tight H behind his ribs from running the ledger's distance in his head. He closed his eyes and listened to the dormitory breathe in a slow collective rhythm. Late, when the other boys' breathing settled into deeper patterns, Jonah rose and slipped into Matron's office again. The ledger sat where she had left it, neat and closed. He did not touch it this time. Instead, he found a small pencil and wrote a single line on an unused margin sheet, a child's name and a date. He did not alter the ledger's column. He did not try to undo what had been signed. He simply recorded the moment where he had failed to stop something and would now watch for the next opening. The chapter closes with the wagon's echo fading down the lane and Jonah folding his wooden carving into the empty pallet, a deliberate act that marks a loss and a small, private vow to act differently tomorrow. The yard is quieter, but nothing is settled. The ledger remains where Matron keeps it, and the dates will come round again. Jonah turns out the lamp and the dormitory breathers on. The night's routine continues, and Jonah sits up one last time to check the latch on the gate before he lies back down. The stamped seal thumped against the wood before Matron Haviland spoke. "They want 6 by dusk. Master Keller from the doorway." Protectiveness tightened Jonah Meyer's chest the way a fist tightens around a small toy. He had learned to feel that not as a signal to move. He pushed past a leaning broom and watched Matron set the paper down like a verdict. The immediate problem hung between them. The mills had sent a demand stamped and signed, and the orphanage's creditors expected delivery that evening. Jonah kept his hands folded at his belly and waited for the room to give him more than the 2 names already underlined at the bottom of the page. He had seen contracts before. He had watched Master Keller point to the ledger in earlier mornings when the wagon came. The memory of the wagon wheel striking frozen ground, the sound from Chapter 1, sat under his ribs as a map of what would happen if he did nothing. He did not invent a plan then, he moved toward one. Matron Haviland did not look surprised. She smoothed the contract with a damp fingertip and tapped the stamped corner. "Payment clears a month of coal," she said, voice low and measured. "We cannot refuse." Her hands were steady. Jonah knew the ledger's logic: names, placements, payments. He had watched her press the pin through the damp paper in the corridor weeks ago and had felt the same cold when the pin bent the list. That fact made the choice immediate and unavoidable. Jonah stepped closer enough to smell boiled linen and camphor on Matron's sleeve. He heard the scrape of Master Keller's boots on the parlor floor, which 6. Keller. His voice cut the room. He was already testing names against muscle and quota. Matron traced down the list with the thin finger that habitually counted on its knuckle. Jonah watched the ledger from the corridor where the light thinned. Doubt came next, a small, bitter weight. He thought of the smaller boys who, in Chapter 2, had crowded the corridor when Matron pushed the pin through the damp paper. He thought of the cramped handprint he had seen beside a younger name then. Doubt shifted to a plan. If one line could bind a child to the mill, maybe a missing line could loosen it. He pictured the dormitory bunks as they were now. A row of breathing figures, shoulders heaving in the cold. He pictured the younger boy, Tom, who kept his cap in his lap and hummed a scrap of song whenever he thought no one watched. Jonah had seen Tom fall asleep with a thumb in his mouth. He had seen Matron place her ledger near the candle and glance at the names before sleep. All of these details became materials. Jonah, Matron, without turning, "You are here." She knew his habit of lingering by the corridor. He straightened, and the room shifted into a problem that required movement. He did not speak. Instead, Jonah moved when Master Keller stepped out to fetch the wagon manifest from the coachman's chest. Keller's boots crossed the flagstones and faded into the yard. The parlor door shut with a soft but exact click. The small window at the parlor's back shed a thin, cold light across the wood. Jonah used that thinness like a door. He slipped to the dormitory along a route he had walked 1,000 times. Past the storage trunk with the torn strap, past the narrow basin where the children's shirts soaked, past the wall where a nail held a single frayed coat. He walked without carrying sound, his protectiveness steeled into a quiet, deliberate action. In the dormitory, Jonah moved among sleeping shapes. He touched a bunk slat to check the paper tucked beneath it, and felt the same grit that had arrived with the wagon's first round of transfers. He found Tom asleep with his cap pulled low. Jonah eased down and reached for the ledger page he had seen Matron keep folded beneath a ledger wait for emergencies, an extra list. A working copy that Matron pulled when hands were needed that night. He had watched her tuck that page away after she pricked the pin through another child's name in Chapter 2. The page was not nailed to the book. It slid free if handled carefully. Jonah's fingers found the corner and raised it. He did not look at the names yet. He moved like a man taking his chance under a roof that had heard bargains and pleas. He slid the page into his smock, then into his pocket. He himself only one thing. By time, he did not plan to run. He planned to confuse the ledger long enough to give a child another bunk, another hour. Back in the parlor, Matron stared at the ledger. The lamplight flattened the lines into black. The contract's stamp glinted like a coin dropped into water. She felt, in a manner Jonah could not read from the corridor, a pressure of creditors and inspections, and a ledger that spoke in sums. Jonah stood just within hearing and caught her low intake of breath. He could not hear words. He heard the counting of decisions. Keller returned with the coachman's list and placed it on the table. Names tally with last week, he said briskly. Who did you mark, Haviland? He pointed to the marginalia, brief notes, a price beside one name, a shorthand for where the child would be placed. Matron's finger hesitated on two names. Jonah held his breath in the corridor and felt doubt shift under the skin into a tight urgency. Fear now threaded his action. He did not have time to plan a complicated escape. He had only moments to adjust the ledger's apparatus. He snuck back into the dormitory and moved a smaller boy, Arthur, from the bunk flagged in the ledger to another bunk farther down the row. He pulled and tucked blankets to leave no impression of movement. Arthur mumbled in sleep and turned his face toward Jonah, then relaxed. Jonah felt a small relief, but he knew moving a child did not erase a stamped contract. When Jonah returned to the corridor, Matron was peeling back the ledger with a careful motion. The page with Tom's name was not where it should be. Jonah held his tongue. Matron's eyes narrowed. She did not leave the table. She reached for the pen and then paused. A new emotion rose in Jonah, a hope that perhaps a signature could be delayed, that hesitation might be a substitute for refusal. Master Keller looked up sharply. Haviland, he said, we need certainty. Who is going tonight? His words snapped the room into a concrete order. Jonah could feel the ledger's teeth closing. The adults argued in numbers. Placements, ages, wages secured. Their voices were steady and made of commerce. Jonah's plan had to become a physical obstruction. He moved again. Jonah's hands found the page he had tucked into his smock and pulled it free. He unfolded it just enough to see the names. Tom's name lay in the middle. Beside it, someone had written a number and a short note about apprenticeship. Jonah's fingers trembled. His throat filled with the salt taste of fear. He folded the page and, with a sharp motion, ripped out the line. The sound of tearing was small but absolute. Someone at the table gave a sharp intake of breath. Matron's eyelids lifted. Keller's hand brushed the leather of his pocket where a whistle hung. Jonah had not meant to show his face. He stepped forward with the torn page open and dropped it on the table between them. Matron Haviland's voice steadied into a reprimand. Jonah, she asked, what are you doing? Her eyes were not accusatory at first. They were trying to fit this action into the ledger's grammar. Jonah nothing until Keller snapped. Explain yourself. His mouth made the words short and mechanical. Jonah put both hands on the table and looked at the faces he knew. The woman who kept accounts and the man who read hands for work. He spoke with a breathy economy. I tore the line, Jonah. I tore it for Tom. His voice was low. He is small. He hums. He barely eats. He tried to keep each sentence short, so it would carry. The room filled with the sound of their breathing and the creak of the table. Keller let out a dry laugh that held no warmth. You do not get to decide placement, Jonah. We have obligations. He leaned forward. We have creditors, Haviland. We have mills that pay for steady hands. We have a ledger that keeps us fed. Matron's hand closed over the ripped paper and smoothed the torn edge with the precision of someone who had pressed pins into lists before. Jonah watched her thumb trace the tier and felt the ledger's logic settle into her posture. He saw the small hesitation cross her face. A pause that had lengthened since the stamped contract came in. An argument began then, and the room changed its atmosphere into negotiation. Jonah felt each shift of tone as a new variable. He spoke 2 lines and then listened. Matron spoke in slow, tabular sentences about payments, coal, the need for the orphanage to remain open. Keller countered with figures and timetables, with a voice that assumed inevitability. Haviland, Keller, we cannot show weakness. If we do not supply, contracts will go elsewhere. The mill has already scheduled the wagon, Matron. I know. But nothing about this is only arithmetic. She put the torn page on the table and fixed Jonah with a thin look. Who else? She asked. Who have you moved? Jonah named 2. He, Arthur, and then another child whose name echoed from earlier lists. Each name landed like a pebble. The conversation turned to particulars. Ages, strength, apprenticeships. Jonah kept his sentences short. He watched Matron weigh the ledger not as a book of numbers, but as a collection of hands. Keller snapped his fingers once. We will pick the replacement. We pick children who meet the mill's terms. The rest of you prepare them. He turned toward the door, already moving the problem into motions that included harnessing and rosters. Matron's face closed for a moment. Jonah watched the lines between her brows deepen. She folded her hands over the ledger and, in a voice Jonah recognized from moments when she lectured in the infirmary, she said, Keller, come close. This is not only about lists. You will take the boys of working age first. The younger ones I will leave unmarked where I can. Her fingers left the ledger like they were making a covenant, and then retracting. Keller's reply was a single sentence. We do it my way or not at all. Then he named a new child, Mark, who had been mending souls by the fire. The decision landed like a hammer. Jonah felt his hope slip into a narrower place. Resolve shifting into desperation, he moved again. The dormitory had already emptied into a bustle as children were called to finish chores. Jonah found Tom by the basin, water still clinging to his hair. The boy's eyes widened when Jonah pressed a small, worn wooden carving into his hands. Keep this, Jonah mouthed without a sound. Tom's fingers closed on the carving. Jonah him without speaking. Go to the bunk down the row if you are called. The mid-chapter surge came when Matron found the torn page missing one name entirely, and she turned sharp enough to make Jonah look at her. You touched the ledger, she said. It was not an accusation. It was the articulation of breach. Keller's hand went to his belt and his whistle. The parlor became a choral of intention. Those who would force orders and those who would find a way to stall. Jonah had one more motion left in him. He lunged for the ledger before Keller's hand could close the cover. The table resisted and then gave as Jonah's palm slapped across the paper and tore. The action was reckless and physical. It removed the thing that defined the night's commerce. The torn page fluttered like a small, angry bird between the 3 of them. For a moment no one moved. Matron's breath came out in a tight line. Keller's jaw worked. He rubbed his fingers along the chain of his pocket watch. Jonah could feel the shock as the adults recalibrated. The torn line was an act that forced a decision from them, and the suddenness of it changed how they spoke to one another. Matron closed her eyes for one slow count and then opened them. She reached for the contract with a hand that had never trembled when balancing the orphanage books. Bring the wagon around at once, she said. The words were not triumphant, they were the sound of someone choosing from 2 bad rotes. Keller barked orders into the yard. He called the coachman and clipped the list back into something like order. The wagon's wheel would grind across the frozen yard and carry away the chosen children. The parlor emptied into determined action. Blankets fetched, bundles bound, faces washed. Jonah felt each external event trigger another motion. Matron signing a line, Keller selecting a child, the coachman flicking reins. As the twilight narrowed into night, Jonah and Tom stood at the threshold. The wagon creaked in the yard and the coachman called names like a ledger being read aloud. Jonah shivered from cold and something tighter. He had expected resistance. He had not expected Matron's choice to fall where it did. She had signed the remaining papers and chosen a practical replacement, as the beat of the ledger demanded. The result: Tom would not board the wagon that night because of Jonah's tear, but someone else, Mark, would. Jonah pressed the wooden carving into Tom's hand again. "Keep it," he said. The sentence was a small human transaction. Tom's fingers closed. Matron caught Jonah's sleeve and, for the first time that night, her expression let something unguarded slip through. She did not speak of redemption. She spoke in a way that dealt with immediate facts. "Jonah," she said, "you will go with the coach to help steady the younger ones. We will not have 2 runaways tonight." Her mouth tightened. "You are old enough." Jonah's protectiveness shifted into another register: sacrifice. The movement from wanting to save another to stepping forward himself was not a speech, but a series of physical decisions. He folded his shoulders, opened his hands, and did not protest when Matron threaded his name into the manifest. Keller nodded once and did not look at him. On the wagon's threshold, Jonah exchanged the carving with a younger child whose face he had not known before that evening. "For you," Jonah mouthed. The exchange was small and exact. It passed ownership, responsibility, and a token of comfort in a single motion. The coachman's voice counted, the horses stamped, and the orphanage door folded into shadow behind them. The final paragraphs were a settling of motion. The wagon creaked away with fewer bodies than it had come with. Matron closed the ledger and slid it back into the desk drawer. She set the remaining signatures in a row and then, with deliberate hands, locked the drawer. Jonah stood at the wagon's edge and watched the lamplight cut across Master Keller's face as the man checked straps and seams. The night's decisions had run like a visible tally. Torn page, signed contract, a child taken, another kept. Once the wheels had turned and the yard was quieter, Matron walked to the dormitory threshold and paused. She did not make a speech. She folded her hands, then reached inside and set a scrap of bread on Tom's bunk. Jonah watched her place the food. That small act registered as a measure of what she had lost and what she had preserved. There was no redemption proclaimed, only an accounting of breaths and meals. Jonah stepped inside the dormitory and lay down on his bunk with his back to the room, the carved token warm under his palm. He had an H in his jaw from speaking, and his palms smelled of ink and salt. His actions that evening had shifted the ledger's course, but they had not erased the ledger itself. He had traded one page for another. He had traded a small body's certainty for his own. Outside, the wagon's wheels faded in the wet stone. Matron closed the parlor drawer and turned the key once more. Keller stood by the yard gate, his silhouette broad, and tossed the chain of his pocket watch into his palm. Jonah felt the final movement as the door shut. The orphanage had fewer children, the ledger had a new signature, and the night's commerce had been carried away by the mill's demand. The last line of the night was simple and concrete. Jonah handed the small wooden carving to Tom and, as the wagon pulled away, Matron Haviland shut the front door with the same deliberate sound she used to close the ledger. The house settled into its reduced number of breaths. Jonah kept his hands folded over the carved figure and remembered the particular sounds of the wheel on the frozen yard. A noise that had opened every chapter of their life here, and that had now closed this one, at least for tonight.